So this is a molecule, glyphosate, which impairs the microbiome and damages the microbiome by being antibiotic, and impairs this CYP enzyme. Therefore, you become toxified in the long term. The two same researchers here did another review of the literature with, this in mind. Glyphosate inhibits the CYP enzyme and damages the microbiome, and what could be the consequences of that? And the conclusions are that basically glyphosate is involved or mostly responsible for the epidemic of inflammatory and degenerative diseases that we have seen come in the last 15 years. All kinds of cancer, and autism, and obesity, and on and on. And I could show you quite a bit, but I'm just going to restrict myself here. This is from France, 2009. The human endocrine disruption at 0.5 part per million. This is done on human cells. Another paper from the same group, apoptosis in human cells. Apoptosis is a jargon word for cell suicide, cell death. So glyphosate, because it inhibits many enzymes, kills human cells in vitro. The same group again, a glyphosate herbicide. This is about mature rat testicular cells, and you will read in that paper that 1 part per million reduced testosterone by 35%. And I'm sure you all know that male fertility has gone down considerably in the last 20 years, all over the world, but mostly in the Western countries. This is out of Vienna, in Austria, cytotoxic properties of glyphosate and Roundup in human cells. This is 2012 out of Egypt, and the conclusion here is rats fed Roundup Ready corn have damaged liver and kidneys. And this is another study. This is a study, I'm sure some of you know about this. This is a study with exactly the same conclusion. Rats fed Roundup Ready corn have damaged liver and kidneys. This study was published in 2012. This was the first long-term feeding study by Dr. Seralini and his team, a team of toxicologists in France. And they fed the rats Roundup Ready corn for 2 years, the whole length of the life of a rat. And also some of the rats were given water with some glyphosate in it. And what they observed, and they took all kinds of parameters, blood and urine and what have you, weekly for 2 years. And it was very obvious after 4 months that there was damaged liver and kidneys. And then another month or two, and the rats started developing tumors. And I'm sure some of you remember those pictures that were on the internet 2 years ago, and they still float around, of rats with huge tumors. This is from this study. Now, the biotech industry could not tolerate those pictures, and so many biotech people wrote letters to the editors, to the newspapers, and there was a huge campaign to basically vilify this study and explain how those results were not right, and these people didn't know what they were doing. Now, the biotech people are biotech people, they're not toxicologists, but that's beside the point. The point is that the chemical company Monsanto put one of their people on the editorial board of this journal, of the journal where the paper was published, and he very quickly retracted the paper. But there wasn't really much to retract other than the results were inconclusive, which is a laughable conclusion because most scientific studies are inconclusive. That's how science works. There is a small point of validity, is that this was a toxicology study. If you want to do a toxicology study, you have a certain protocol to follow, and you need 10 rats per treatment. If you want to do a carcinogenicity study, and show cancer, you use a different protocol and you need 50 rats. You need a lot more sensitivity. And this was a toxicology study. Therefore, in principle, they could not conclude that there were tumors. Yet the tumors were there, and it was their duty as human beings to report on that. So the paper was retracted 1 year after being published, in plain view of the scientific community, which to me is a new one. Never seen that happen before, and at least for inconclusive results. And of course, republished in a different journal, an online journal, so that it is very public. Everybody can access it, and you can look. I met Dr. Seralini 2 weeks ago in Regina. He was there for a conference, and he spoke about his study, and he definitely stands by his results. Another paper published at the University of Bangkok showing that glyphosate induces human breast cancer cell growth. Cancer cell proliferation is accelerated at parts per trillion to parts per billion. A part per trillion is 1 million times less than a part per million. So you can imagine how incredibly sensitive those cancer cells are. This is a paper published by Dr. André Carrasco in Buenos Aires in Argentina. Dr. Carrasco was asked to go and investigate an epidemic of birth defects in children, in babies, born with half a brain and all kinds of really, really weird congenital malformations. The plains, the pampas in the Argentinas used to be covered in grass to grow cattle for the North American and the European market. That's all gone. Now they grow engineered soybean. And the acreage are so huge that, of course, it's all spread by airplanes. And babies are born with birth defects. And so Dr. Carrasco, who was the head of the embryology department in Buenos Aires, went to investigate, came back to his lab, injected frog embryos, frog eggs, with picoliters, extremely tiny, tiny quantities of glyphosate, and was able to replicate the birth defect he saw in humans. This is another paper published, birth defects in pigs, that was published last year. This is a team of researchers from Germany who fed pigs Roundup Ready corn, and when the sows gave birth to piglets, many of the piglets were deformed, again with congenital malformations. This is the same team in Germany, in the University of Leipzig in Germany, who looked for glyphosate residues in animals and humans. If you go to the website of the chemical company Monsanto, you will read that if by accident you were to ingest some glyphosate, you will flush it through the next day. It does not stick, it just goes through like water. And this paper tells exactly the opposite. It does stick. Not only does it stick, it bioaccumulates. And the same paper had this interesting observation. Chronically ill people have higher glyphosate residue in their urine than healthy people. This was published this year in 2014. Okay, so this is a study that was published last week by Dr. Nancy Swanson, and again, it's reference number 11 on your list. Dr. Nancy Swanson published a paper. This is a correlation analysis, and she did a correlation analysis of 2 sets of data and published that. And what she did is she took 2 sets of data, one set of data from the US Center for Disease Control. The US Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia keeps a tab on the health of American citizens, how many people were diagnosed with obesity, how many people went to the hospital with liver damage or kidney failure this year and last year, etc. How many children were diagnosed on the autistic spectrum this year. And The other set of data was from the US Department of Agriculture, which of course keeps tab on the agriculture. So how many millions of acres planted in engineered corn, in Roundup Ready soy or corn this year, last year, etc. And she put the two together. The axis showing you the incredible success of the technology. Roundup Ready soy and corn are going up and up and up, almost up to 100%, as I showed you earlier. But you would also show, and the curves, the graphs all go from 1990 to 2010. And you would also see that every year, this is for autism, every year there will be a bar for how many children were diagnosed on the autistic spectrum this year. And you would see that it's a pretty good fit. When you do a correlation analysis, you end up with a few numbers. One of them are called the correlation coefficient, R values. And if you have a value of 1, you have a perfect fit. You are almost demonstrating causation. When you have a value of 0.9, 0.95, 0.99, this is a very high correlation coefficient value. It basically tells you there is a link. It tells scientists who do this sort of statistical analysis, this is where you should look. This is where you want to dig and do some experiments or somehow make it clearer. There is a link. There is a linkage. Statistical analysis, form of statistical analysis, the correlation analysis, has a weakness. The weakness is that you could replace one of the sets of data with something else and come up with the same correlation coefficient, and you could say, well, that becomes meaningless then. And for example, I get this reaction from the biotech people often. Autism is obviously caused by organic food. Therefore, the whole paper, everything should be thrown out, which is a very unscientific stance. If you're a scientist and you do this, you are looking for a link, for a finger pointing at something. There's a link between the two sets of data. And saying that, oh, it is a coincidence, or you can do this, is absolutely meaningless and a very unscientific stance. I get this from time to time. This is a summary of the results of Dr. Swanson's analysis. Roundup Ready soy and corn and autism, the correlation coefficients are here. This is what you were looking at earlier. And you can look at celiac, intestinal infection, all kinds of cancer, kidney failure, diabetes, obesity, dementia, and there's quite a few others. So basically, her correlation analysis is illustrating the link that was postulated or suggested or shown by earlier papers that I showed you today. This is a paper from Dr. Kaplan, her team. She is a psychiatrist in Calgary. She works at the University Hospital in Calgary. She does what she calls nutritional psychiatry. She works with autistic children, and she feeds them mineral supplements, and they get better quickly. These numbers are from the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. I don't know what the numbers are in Canada, but I assume they're quite similar, since we are very much in harmony. Harmonization is the word. The EPA in 2013 raised the legal residues of glyphosate in foods considerably, by a factor of 2 or 10 or 100, depending. There were no studies done, just because just to accommodate the new reality of the residues of glyphosate going up in the food significantly, because the technology is so successful that glyphosate has become a really serious contaminant in the food system. And this is from the EPA website. There is a page, several pages on basic information about glyphosate in drinking water, and you will read that the maximum contaminant level is 0.7 milligram per liter. And a little further on the page, you will read this, that people drinking water containing more than 0.7 parts per million of glyphosate may develop kidney problems and infertility. And what I've shown you today is that there's a whole host of other symptoms that would appear when you become contaminated, whatever word you want to use, with glyphosate. This is my last slide. And this is basically the state of the world today. Because in North America, we're a bit in the biotech bubble and we think the world is like here. But it isn't at all. In white are the countries that have absolutely no regulation of Roundup. Remember what I said earlier. Roundup was registered in 1974. Glyphosate was registered in 1974 as completely innocuous. It has no acute toxicity. Therefore, it is absolutely safe. There is absolutely no need to regulate it at all. Nobody at the time even thought that because of its chemistry, because of how it works, there may be some chronic implication for health in humans and animals. In orange are all the countries that have some legislation, some regulation, some form of regulation. Oftentimes it is labeling in the food stores. And in red, the countries with a red dot are the dozen countries or so that have banned the technology. There is no Roundup Ready crops grown in those countries. There is no Roundup Ready food imported in those countries, and there is no need for labeling. Thank you very much.